Welcome back to Politics Chat. There's a ton going on, and I have to say, you people really should see how often you can get me to get on the road and not have access to the news, because when I do, everything seems to explode. Let's start right in today with some of the Supreme Court decisions that are coming down. So today, the Supreme Court decided Moore versus Harper. And just so you know, whenever you see in the newspaper like Moore and then V and then Harper, V means versus. So it's called Moore v. Harper because lawyers are cool. I don't know. But anyway, Moore v. Harper was a case that many of us have been extremely concerned about since the court said last June 30th, I think it was, that it was going to take the case, because the case was about who ultimately gets to decide the nature of federal elections. And the reason this was a really big deal was because especially the Trump campaign although there had been radicals in the Republican Party making this argument for quite a while, but the Trump campaign really launched hold of it. What they were saying was that the Constitution, and I'll give you the clause of the Constitution, the one that says each state shall appoint in such a manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors. So they pointed to that in the Constitution and said the state legislatures can decide whatever they want, however they want, to choose presidential electors. And that is, I just can't tell you what a red flag that is for historians, because that's actually exactly what South Carolina did in 1860. It was the only state that did that, and that didn't go very well. If you remember, they're the ones who decided that they should secede and start a rebellion and the whole thing. But the way that clause has always been interpreted is to say that legislatures generally meant a state's apparatus of lawmaking. So certainly the legislature, but also the state courts, and all of them operating under the state constitution. And what the people who were arguing for the independent state legislature doctrine were saying was that no, the legislatures can do whatever they want. It doesn't matter what the courts say. It doesn't matter what the Constitution says, state constitutions say. We can do whatever we want. So the case itself came out of North Carolina, where after the 2020, you can see how great I am with numbers, right? After the 2020 census, the North Carolina state legislature, which is heavily gerrymandered, redistricted the state in such a way that it favored Republicans, like off the charts favored Republicans. So people brought lawsuits against that, and groups brought lawsuits and said, this is crazy. You've just locked in a Republican majority, so Democratic votes simply don't count. And a state, the state Supreme Court said, yeah, you can't do this. This is ridiculous. You're under the state constitution, you can't do this. So they appealed to the Supreme Court, which in the fall before the 2022 election simply said, well, we'll take this case, but until we do, you have to leave that map, the bad map, in power. You have to leave it in power. So that case that went forward from before the 2022 election is Moore versus Harper, in which the plaintiffs were the state legislature was saying we get to do whatever we want, and because of the Constitution. And in this case, the Supreme Court had already said, well, federal courts can't say anything about how states decide how districts should be carved up. So now they were going to have to see whether state courts could do anything under the state constitution. And by a fairly large margin, 6-3, the Supreme Court did in fact say, yeah, the state courts can say these laws are unconstitutional under the state constitution. So this is a really big deal for a number of reasons. It's a really big deal, first of all, because everybody who studies this, their hair was on fire with the idea that basically states that had severely gerrymandered their voting districts so that their super majorities in those states of one party or another, although it's primarily Republicans who've done that, basically you're getting rid of voting. you're saying, you know, as long as you've managed to steal the legislature, you get to have the president. And that's, you know, that's a recipe for authoritarianism. It was really, really scary. So that's one thing. But there's another piece that I find really, I mean, that's the biggie. Okay, just right there. But there's another piece that I find really interesting, and that's that there are currently, right now, I just looked this up, 28 active cases in states about partisan or about challenging district maps, and 7 of them are about partisan gerrymandering. So there are 7 lawsuits right now on this very issue, and there are 28 lawsuits right now on similar issues. Now, so what that suggests is there's going to be some adjustments about how much states can use partisan gerrymandering. And by the way, if you really could just partisan gerrymander everything, the Democrats could do really well, because they could have New York and they could have California. But the whole point is you don't really want either side to be doing it, because then essentially your vote doesn't count if you're in a if you're a minority of 49.9 as opposed to 50.1. And even in some of those states, as you know, the Republicans can lose by significant amounts and still take the state legislature in places like North Carolina. So that attempt to at least begin to address partisan gerrymandering is a huge deal for advocates of democracy. But it also goes hand in hand with other decisions. So, for example, even the fact that Wisconsin voters elected Janet Protasiewicz in, was it April, who is going to sit on the Supreme Court of Wisconsin, which is going to have something to say there about Wisconsin gerrymandering. That's a huge deal. And then on June 8th, the Supreme Court of the United States handed down Allen v. Milligan. And Allen v. Milligan was also a gerrymandering case. And it was one based on an Alabama redistricting. After the 2020 census, it turned out that the percentage, the population of Alabama had stayed about the same, but the percentage of Black people and white people had switched by about 4%, times and temperatures being relative, of course, here. It slipped by about 4%. And when they redistricted the state after the 2020 census, they simply didn't do that. They packed all the Black voters into one district and then spread them out so thoroughly in the other districts that basically their votes didn't count proportionately as they should have. So the Supreme Court did in fact say, yes, this is illegal under or it looks like it would have been illegal under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And the Voting Rights Act is the one that says that you can't have your vote taken away from you on the basis of race. So they said, yeah, we're going to keep Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. That itself was a big deal because the Supreme Court has been gutting the Voting Rights Act, but they kept that piece of it. There, too, there are currently 32 active lawsuits in 10 states under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So those 2 decisions are real wake-up calls for the Republican state legislatures that have been carving up their states so that Democrats can't get a leg up, or can't get, not even a leg up, can't even play on a level playing field. So both of those things are huge. But here's another piece of them, and this is the piece that really jumps out to me. And that is that the Supreme Court put holds on both of those decisions until after the 2022 election. And what that means is that, as I said to you before over a different case, it certainly looks as if, had fairer maps been in place before the 2022 election, the Republicans would not have control of the House of Representatives right now. That's a really big deal. It's a big deal partly because of what the Supreme Court did to make that happen, advertent or not. But it's also a big deal because the Republican Congress, the House of Representatives, does not reflect what the American people wanted. And it is completely dysfunctional. So there's a lot of questions about why the Supreme Court did what it did today, because a lot of us were really scared it would go the other way. And I don't know the answer to that. I'm not in their heads, and I won't know the answer to what's in their heads. But it is certainly clear that of late, Samuel Alito's not looking really good right now, between the fact he took that plane flight, and then the hospitality offered by somebody else in Alaska, the huge amounts of money there, the fact that he went running to the Wall Street Journal to get ahead of the story, the fact that it looks quite a bit as if he is the person who leaked the Dobbs decision and the previous Hobby Lobby decision. He's not looking really very good right now, nor, of course, is Justice Clarence Thomas, whose behavior has, I just can't believe that even Republicans aren't coming out and saying we cannot have a Supreme Court justice who has accepted hundreds of thousands of dollars in gifts from somebody who had business before the court, and who has, done all these things that he shouldn't have done. So it might be in part that the Supreme Court is extremely concerned about losing any legitimacy it might have left. As you know, the numbers are in the toilet. They're the lowest that they've been since Gallup started polling that. The popularity of the Supreme Court, or not the popularity, the respect for the legitimacy of. There we go. But it also, historically, when the Supreme Court goes too far in one direction, especially a reactionary direction, and people start to push back, often the Supreme Court backs off on itself. And I'm really wondering about that again. And I will never write about this, but this is live, and I can always be wrong. One of the things about the Moore v. Harper decision is the degree to which the decision focuses on the concept of judicial review. Now, as I've said to you 100 times before, because it fascinates me, we don't get the concept of judicial review for the United States Supreme Court until 1803 with Marbury versus Madison. And that's a great case, but that's the point where the Supreme Court says, hey, wait a minute, who gets to decide whether or not a law is unconstitutional or not? I guess it'll be us. They took that power on themselves, and that's not in the Constitution. And one of the things that's in Moore v. Harper is a long disquisition on the concept of judicial review, arguing that it is in fact not Marbury v. Madison that gives the Supreme Court the right to judicial review, but rather the state traditions of judicial review before Marbury. And I personally, probably because my mind is thinking along it, and maybe this isn't what they intended, but I wonder to what degree the Supreme Court is concerned that if they keep making these crazy decisions that overturn settled law in America, whether they're worried that Congress might say, hey, let's take another look at judicial review here. And so this would be a very good place to back off, because everybody unless you're an extraordinary Trump partisan, everybody who has looked at the independent state legislature doctrine says it's crap. Like, there's absolutely no way that the people who framed the Constitution, who were terrified of the power of the executive for sure, but also of state legislatures, they're very articulate about that they would have said, oh yeah, whatever, we'll just let the state legislatures decide all that. They never would have done that. And not simply lawyers who tend to vote on the left say that, but also lawyers on the right side, including Judge Ludig. Michael Ludig, who is sort of the guru of a lot of right-wing judges, who was like, this is bonkers. And he's been out front on this all along, making this argument. I very much admire the way that man's brain works, and he's been out there. I wish he wrote a little clearer, because I think everybody should understand the concepts that he talks about, but sometimes he's a little opaque when you read him. He's got articles all over the place today too, but if you want to look up what he says, his name is Ludig, Luttig. I know it should be Luddig, but it's not, it's Ludig. anyway, so that's what's been happening in the Supreme Court, and it's huge. So that's huge. Of course, that's not the only thing that's going on. God help me in this letter tonight. And I have to say, over the weekend, there was one day I actually thought about writing 2 letters, and I thought, no, that's cheating. I can't do that. So there was one that was longer than it ought to have been. I'm doing the best I can over here. All right, so the next thing on my docket is the Trump tape and the indictment of former President Donald Trump on 36 counts. I'm sorry, one involves only Walt Nauta, for withholding from people who should have been able to have them. The wording in the Espionage Act is very particular, and it is the same wording that the indictments use. You're supposed to turn over documents to people who are supposed to receive them, and he did not do so. Plus, he hid them. Plus, he obstructed justice, according to this indictment. And of course, one of the things that we now know is that he is on tape, apparently showing to, I think it's 3 people associated with Mark Meadows, who was having his autobiography ghostwritten, and showing what sounds like showing a document to him. And I think it was just last night, CNN released a copy of that tape, so you could hear it yourself. And that itself is very interesting because it's not supposed to be released. So the question is who released it and all that. But the tape is devastating. It's about 2 minutes long. You ought to listen to it. And the sheer raging fury that you feel when you hear a former president who had our lives in his hands, laughing, in a group of laughing people, showing them something that he says is top secret. The fact that we have our people on the line right now to keep us safe, when somebody that we elected to do that for us is treating it like dirt, not even like dirt, like excrement. Anyway, you ought to listen to it. Really, really hard to see how he's going to walk away from this. And on Truth Social, shortly after the tape came out, he exploded, and he's making comments about Special Counsel Jack Smith and his family, and all kinds of things that are really over the top, which I think indicates he knows he's really in trouble and he's really concerned. And at this point, he has very few arrows in his quiver except to try and whip up some kind of popular fury, some kind of popular violence on his behalf. And yet, his numbers seem to be dwindling, and the support for him seems to be dwindling. So he's getting more and more outraged and more extreme in his commentary. So why does that matter? I mean, aside from all the obvious things, the Republican Party is absolutely in crisis, which, if it weren't personal, it would be really interesting, right? If we weren't actually living through this moment. And remember that while the special counsel, Jack Smith, just handed down indictments in Florida over those documents, those top secret documents, and documents marked classified and so on. He only did it in Florida. He did not do it in New Jersey, where at least this tape is from. The idea that there was at least a document in New Jersey, and it hasn't happened in federal court in Washington D.C. either. So there is speculation that those cases might also go forward under certain circumstances. But while there's that investigation and that produced those indictments, remember, he had 2 charges, not 1. 2 charges. The second one was he is looking into the events surrounding the attempt to overturn the presidential election of 2020. Because remember, the Trump people didn't want to overturn the entire election. They kept saying, oh, the local elections were fine and the congressional elections were fine. It was just Trump's that they said was bad, which doesn't make any sense because that's of course not how ballots work. But in the process of looking into that, one of the things that has really been striking about Smith's investigations is how little is leaking about them. The only things we know are when somebody who has been interviewed goes in front of the cameras or tells a reporter that she or he or they or whomever have been interviewed, or we hear about it if people in front of the courthouse see people going in. So we don't know what he has done. We don't know what he's doing. Certainly when the Mar-a-Lago indictments came down, if you're at all interested, I would urge you to read the indictment. It's really easy to read. It's not all legalese. It's very easy to read. And heavens, is it thorough. And, you read this thing and you think, oh my God, they know everything. Now, I don't know if they know everything or not, but it sure reads like they know everything. Okay. So remember the other case is about trying to steal the 2020 election. Let your mind work on that for a minute. Whom does that involve? Right? So if you were part of that effort, and that includes, of course, not just the president and the circle around the president, it includes possibly people who were at the January 5th rally the night before January 6th, 2021. And of course, we do know now that one of Alex Jones's sidekicks who was there and who was also at the so-called war room the night of January 5th has flipped and is working with prosecutors. He was also on the encrypted chat with a certain number of those people. There was an encrypted chat, I think it was 47 people. They were known as the Friends of Roger. Friends of Stone. It was Roger Stone's friends. So FOS, Friends of Stone. So if you're one of those people, you don't know what they've got. What about if you are a member of Congress? Remember the January 6th committee in the House Special Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. I wrote that 6 million times. I can't tell you how much I hope the rest of the investigating committees keep their titles short. They deliberately limited their investigation to President Trump for various reasons, various good reasons, I think. But what if you were a member of the House of Representatives, for example, who had something to do with that? And there certainly have been glimmerings and more than glimmerings that there are Congress critters who certainly did not hesitate to help. If you're one of them, you must be getting really nervous, right? So this was all a lead up for me to tell you that one of the other things that we learned, I guess it was just yesterday, was that one of the people that Jack Smith has interviewed is Brad Raffensberger from Georgia. Now, if you remember, Raffensberger was, I feel like I'm the person here keeping score because I've read so much of this stuff. Like, remember Raffensberger? Raffensberger was is the Secretary of State in Georgia. And he was the one that Trump called to say, I just want you to find me several thousand, tens of thousands of votes. I don't remember what the actual number is off the top of my head. He said, I just need one more than Biden won the state by. I just want you to find me those votes. So Raffensberger recorded that call. The call was about an hour long. You can listen to the video of it. It is also available online. The New York Times put it up almost instantly as soon as we learned about it. And it's really shocking. Also on that call, by the way, was Cleta Mitchell, who is the woman who's trying to get rid of young people voting and also and put voting restrictions all over the place now. She got thrown out of her legal position at that point. After that happened. But anyway, there were a bunch of people on that call. So Smith has interviewed Raffensberger, or so we heard yesterday. And why does that matter? If you remember, why did Raffensberger record that call legally, by the way? In Georgia, you only have to have permission from one side of the call, not both sides of it. Why did he do that? He says he did it because he had gotten a call previously from Lindsey Graham, the South Carolina senator. And Lindsey Graham, of course, came out and said, oh, no, I didn't do that. Well, Raffensberger is testifying, and he's, I assume, testifying under oath. So again, I'm not going down a particular rabbit hole there, but making the point that if you are somehow involved in the January 6th events and the events leading up to it, you're really nervous right now. Okay, so one of the things I said is we care about all this, the Trump tape and all this, the Trump tape and the January 6th investigation, because the Republicans are panicked. The clear frontrunner in the Republican Party for the 2024 election is Donald Trump. And the reason for that is because the primary voters who turn out to vote on the Republican side are the Trump loyalists. They're the people who are the far right, and they won't turn out for anybody else. They belong to Trump. And one of the problems that the Republican Party has gotten into is many people after January 6th wanted those voters. So they tried to kind of court those voters. But what's happened is they've ended up so horrifying people who were not Trump voters that they've moved farther and farther right. And then, of course, we got this House of Representatives dominated by Republicans. And because they were so fractured, in order to become House Speaker, Kevin McCarthy, the representative from California, had to cater to that far right. And so the House of Representatives has now gone really far right, and they can't manage to do anything because they're bitterly divided between the extreme far right and just the far right. It's really astonishing to watch as somebody who studies Congress. They can't seem to accomplish anything at all, and that's not going to get better anywhere anytime soon. So if you are a Republican who wants to make sure the Democrats don't want to win, so aren't going to win in 2024, you have only a couple of things to hope for. And of course, one is that the Democrats will forget about abortion. They will forget about voting rights. They will forget about all that stuff and come over to you. Don't hold your breath on that one. But there are two things you can push on. The first is that probably no, it's not the most important. There are two things you can push on. One, you can push on the fact that this is a horrible Senate map for Democrats in 2024. That is, there are 34 seats up for re-election in 2024, and Democrats are going to have to defend 23 of them. That's a really hard row to hoe. Even if the Democrats do incredibly well, having to defend 23 seats is a lot. And it's just the luck of the draw, because a third of the Senate comes up every 2 years. That's just the way it is in 2024. So if you are somebody like Mitch McConnell, you're hoping you can hold the Senate. You're hoping you can get the Senate back. Even if you can't get the presidency, and even if you're going to lose the House of Representatives, you're hoping for the Senate. Why are you hoping for the Senate? Because the second piece that the Republicans can really push on is tax cuts. If you've been watching sort of out of the side of your vision, the Republicans in the House and the Senate, of course, but in the House, have been pushing and pushing and pushing for more tax cuts, and including the defunding of the IRS, which they're trying to bill as, we're going to make sure the IRS doesn't come for you, little guy. But every study will tell you that for every dollar you put into the IRS, you get $12 back. It's incredibly good, it's incredibly valuable money spent, because what it means is that if you adequately fund the IRS, they go after the big tax cheats. And those big tax cheats then have to cough up money. And it's incredibly good for the country, but it's not so good for the tax cheats. And so the two pieces that the Republicans are really pushing on right now are trying to hold the Senate, at least the way it looks like to me, trying to hold the Senate, and trying again to emphasize, just if you keep us in power, we'll, to rich people who might otherwise be like, we don't want any part of this mess right now. Put us in power in the Senate at least, so we can hang on to those tax cuts. And that's my guess is how things are playing out right now anyway. But the party itself is in huge trouble. It has shackled itself to a person who looks as if he is the biggest criminal, one of the biggest criminals the United States has ever had. I mean, this leak of this stealing of documents is just extraordinary. And if you were that political party man, you'd be in real trouble. One of the reasons I think it's so interesting that Chris Christie, the former governor of New Jersey, is running around finally calling Trump out on stuff is because certainly Republicans are starting to think, I'm not a Democrat, but man, I got to put some distance between me and this guy, or no Republican's ever going to get elected again. So I'm watching him really closely. All right. So if that's those two stories, what about Wagner and what happened in Russia? I don't know what happened in Russia. And I'm trying to learn. I've got people trying to help me learn what the heck just happened in Russia and Belarus. I don't know anything about that because I don't know anything about internal politics. But what I do know a lot about is power. And one of the things that virtually everybody agrees on, and honestly, I don't need an expert in Russia to say this, is that Putin's power has been built in large part by his air of invincibility and by the idea he had this group of thugs at his back so that all he had to do was flex his muscles and there would be an army at his back. Those two things were both proven wrong over the weekend. He was clearly not invincible. The Wagner group managed to push almost all the way to Moscow before it gave up, basically, because for I don't know, I'm not going to speculate as what the many reasons might be. I've certainly read about them, but I shouldn't opine about Russia because I only know America. But it's clear that the man is significantly weakened, not only because they pushed that far, but think about why they pushed that far. Nobody stopped them. I mean, you would think that, the FSB would have gotten in the way. Somebody would have gotten in the way and said, no, you can't go any further. We care about our president. We care about our country. And the fact that so many people were cheering them on, cheering the Wagner group on, and when the leader turned around and left, they're all coming running after him to shake his hand, suggests that people are really unhappy currently with Putin's regime. It is likely they can't think of a better person to replace him with right now, but he has been significantly weakened. Why does this matter? Well, first of all, it matters because of Ukraine, which this is a huge morale boost, or seems like it should be when their counteroffensive is not moving as fast as they had hoped. But also, if you are somebody who in the last 10, 20 years has become attached to Russia because you believe that Putin is a strong leader that you should follow and can bring benefits to your region, you should be rethinking that. So there's a lot of articles out today about how some of the countries around Russia that had been sort of being pulled into the sphere of Russia are now stepping back and saying, like, wait a minute, maybe this isn't such a great place to be. Similarly, and this is the one that fascinates me, as you know, I am really interested in Africa and the Indo-Pacific. And in Africa, remember, I've talked a lot about how the United States backed away from Africa compared to China and Russia, because, for a number of reasons, but certainly under Trump, who referred to the not great name for African countries. We kind of backed away. And as we backed away, China began to invest in Africa into infrastructure projects, for example, and roads and all sorts of loans to help the country develop. The Wagner Group got involved for Russia in Africa to prop up warlords, essentially, or autocrats, and to extract money from the region in the form of gold, from gold and different raw materials. A lot of money coming from Africa into the Wagner Group, which is one of the reasons I suspect that Putin was reluctant to put a quick end to their leader, because there's the whole Africa piece of it. I don't know that. I don't read Russian, but if it were me, I'd be like, crap, I need him in Africa, and I need his men in Africa. But if you are an African leader who has been propped up by Wagner, And now you don't know what's going on in Russia. You're in trouble. And there was a great piece today in the Daily Beast that said, it was talking about an African leader sort of calling around on the weekend going, what's happening? What's happening? You know, where's Wagner? Are they falling apart? What's going to happen? Those pieces are incredibly important. And there's a bigger picture important to them as well. And that is that when President Joe Biden took office, he and his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, repeatedly talked about how they wanted to demonstrate that democracy was stronger than authoritarianism, that countries that were sliding toward authoritarianism should rethink that, because democracies were healthier and better places. And I got to tell you, I drove a long way today, and I just kept thinking about, imagine if Trump had won in 2020 and had been in the White House, because he certainly would not have brought NATO together. He was going to leave NATO in his second term. He said that. He worked to weaken it his first term. He was going to get rid of it in the second term. Once the United States had left NATO, NATO would not have been any kind of an institution that could have withstood Putin's second invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. So you would have to assume that if Trump had won in 2020, Putin would have walked into that eastern part of Ukraine that he wanted so badly. And this is kind of in the weeds, and I'm a little sorry for that, but not totally. If you read the Senate report on the Russian interference in the 2016 election, which is, there's a lot of it, and you may not want to read the whole thing, but what you could do is search for the word Ukraine. Or the word Manafort, because in that testimony that the Senate quotes, both Paul Manafort and his associate Rick Gates, and Manafort was Trump's campaign manager, both of them talk on more than one occasion about how what the Russian operatives they were talking to wanted from the Trump campaign was not just sanctions lifted, which is what I thought it was all about. They wanted to walk into those 4 eastern oblasts of Ukraine. And essentially, it looks like when Biden was elected, Putin just went ahead and did it militarily, as opposed to setting up. Maybe you remember, Putin has gone ahead and tried to set up, he had a vote in those oblasts that they're now Russian, and that kind of got forgotten. But that was apparently part of the plan. And you can read about that in the Senate report. But if that had happened, and if Putin now, whose internal strength was in trouble when he invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, every time there's an invasion, the first place to look is inside the country that's invading, not outside, because almost always an invasion is about internal politics, paradoxically. And you can see by the fact that Alexei Navalny had put up such resistance to Putin, and that Putin felt so threatened by him that he was concerned about internal politics. But if he had gone ahead and gotten all that huge section of Ukraine, including really valuable ports, think of what the world would have looked like. Europe would be not literally crumbling, but Europe would not be able to, would be in a much weaker position than it is now. The allies that have come to NATO and to all kinds of alliances around NATO, AUKUS, for example, and the Pacific Islands and the CETO and all those kind of new alliances, or older alliances that have been further built, they would not be strong. They would be weakened. The strong pieces of the globe would be Russia and would be China. If you remember, right before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, China, I'm sorry, I do this without notes, so I'm like trying to see the map here. And I've probably put the oblasts on the wrong side of Ukraine or something. No, they should be on the east. But But if you remember right before that, China declared loyalty, that Russia and China were going to be loyal to each other. These are two autocrats standing against the rest of the world, standing against the democratic world. And both of them, the leader of China, Xi Jinping, and Vladimir Putin, and then, of course, other people like Viktor Orban of Hungary, and to some degree, Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus, and Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil, and have talked about how democracy doesn't work anymore. Democracy is either too slow to respond to the modern world, or it weakens a nation, or, and this is really what Viktor Orban is pushing and why the radical right in America so lionizes Orban, the concept of equality before the law means that you are destroying a nation because it permits LGBTQ plus people to participate equally in society. It lets women participate equally in society. It breaks down traditional structures of patriarchy, and it permits immigrants to immigrate and to join a society. And so they literally have called for getting rid of democracy. They're calling for a post-liberal order that is a post-democracy order. And if Trump had been in office in 2020, and you were looking at the globe right now, you would see Russia incredibly strong, Europe and Ukraine, I'm sorry, Ukraine's part of Europe, but that whole organization not crumbling, but much weaker, kind of on the ropes. Think of what the United States democracy would look like. We would absolutely have moved much closer to Orban's illiberal model than the democracy that we have now. Africa, what are they going to do? They're looking at the concept of protecting democracy in places like Ghana, and you'd have Wagner mercenaries throwing their weight around the same way that the democracy is being destroyed in Sudan. And and of course China would say, hey, we backed the right horse, because Biden was in office and put NATO together to help stand behind the Ukrainians, who, by the way, are doing it themselves. And, once again, we're providing money and material. It's their lives that are on the line. The entire globe has shifted. And I was driving today thinking about that, and I'm thinking, for all that many of us are concerned about where the country is right now and where the world is right now, what a bullet dodged. I mean, I normally when I'd take a long drive, I'd pull off and nap. And I didn't, because I was so awake the whole way, being like, oh my God, how close we came. So the reason that all this, whatever's happening in Russia itself and in Ukraine, that's going to matter a lot. But the global meaning of this moment is really stunning compared to what it could have been had that election gone the other way. All right. Now there's a couple of questions that people asked, 3 questions actually, that actually fit really nicely in this. So, and I didn't write down your names, I'm sorry. Somebody asked, or said, and I think this is a really good point, that the United States cannot impose democracy on other countries without it becoming colonialism. And this is a really important point, and it's a really important intellectual point. So how do you encourage democracy around the world without becoming a colonial power, or without enforcing your will on somebody else? And this, by the way, is not a new problem. This is something the United States has been grappling with since the Spanish-American War of 1898. And that's a real intellectual problem. And I think that one of the ways that the Biden administration, or the way the Biden administration is trying to get around that concept, is by focusing on creating regions in the nation, or supporting regional power in I said the nation, I meant the globe, supporting regional power blocks around the globe, where those blocks should make up their own decisions, and the United States is hoping to be a partner in those, but not the dictator. So what do I mean by that? I mean by, for example, immigration on the southern border of the United States. Rather than turning that into the United States versus all of Latin America, what the Biden administration has done is it has tried to keep migrants in their home countries, where they can apply for asylum from those countries, and for asylum in neighboring countries to the countries in which they live, which gives those other countries ownership of the problem, and trying to focus on the idea that there has to be a local solution. Similarly, in the Indo-Pacific, rather than turning the fight between the United States and China into two great powers, pissing at each other, the Biden administration has really worked to shore up the strength of a lot of countries in the Indo-Pacific, bringing new business into Vietnam, supporting Prime Minister Modi last week. Was it just last week at the White House? That idea is to sort of say, everybody needs to have a voice at the table. And I actually think it's a really interesting concept. I think it's incredibly complicated. I think it's a very interesting concept, but it is not unproblematic. So, for example, with the state visit of Modi last week, you saw protests on the part of the far progressive group in the House of Representatives, the Democrats, and a letter from a number of Democrats written to President Biden, saying, Modi's been cracking down on Muslims in India. How can you have somebody who has created these human rights and religious violations be part of the United States foreign policy? And it's a problem, right? On the other hand, you can't very well write off India, So when I try and look back on this, I try and look at it from 150 years. If I were writing a book on this moment, at least as it looks from here, you're seeing this shift because there's an intellectual problem with how do you make a democracy, the concept of democracy, global. Much easier to make authoritarianism global. You just march into another country and take it over. But if you're trying to support self-determination without colonialism, what does that look like? And this seems to be what the Biden administration is trying to do. And, this is one of those things, I don't know what the outcome is going to be. I certainly like the concept of it very much, but I do recognize that there are problems with it. And I would urge you to think about it and think about what makes sense. I think this makes more sense to me than anything else I've seen. I don't like the idea of marching into other countries and telling them what to do, but I also don't like the idea of sort of keeping our hands off altogether and turning all of our foreign policy, or much of our foreign policy influence, over to money, basically, private capital. So anyway, I think that that's what's going on. And somebody said here that democracy must be homegrown. I think that's right, but how do you encourage people to support the idea of homegrown democracy? And again, what the Biden administration has been doing is investing in the operations of democracy rather than in the operations of capitalism, which is what we began doing in the 1990s to support democracy in former Soviet republics. And boy, was that a disaster, right? Because we didn't teach anybody about democracy. We only taught them about capitalism. All right, so I thought that was a really interesting question. But here's another really interesting question, and that is, why are people leaning toward authoritarian governments? Like, why do people do that? Is it because there are too many people? Is it because people aren't educated? Why is that? And I will answer that. I wanted to answer with that and one other question that you had. Remember that I am an idealist. And so somebody else would give you a completely different answer, but that's what historians do. We look at the world and we see it through a certain lens. I believe that ideas change society. The way people think about things changes their behavior. So if I want to change their behavior, I'm going to look at the way people think about things. And in order to change that behavior, I'm going to try and change the way they think. So I would make an argument that all of a sudden I'm kind of laughing at myself here because you can tell I'm starting to get enough sleep again because now that the book is done, because like I'm really interested in intellectual arguments again, which I feel like for 2 years, I'm just like, what happened today? I would argue that people who believed in democracy made a terrible error. After the fall or the crumbling of the USSR in 1991, I think people who believed in democracy, well, let me even take it back earlier than that. I think that by about 1960, and there's a very famous article written in 1960 saying this, people who believed in democracy in the United States no longer thought they had to defend it because they believed that everybody liked it. Everybody in the United States liked it. There really wasn't much argument about it. And so there wasn't really any point in talking about democracy any longer. And, if you actually listen to the 1960 presidential debates between Nixon and Kennedy, you'll hear them talking about actual principles. And by, and 64, certain, and 65, certainly LBJ was doing so. By 68, Nixon's not doing that at all anymore. He's only using imagery. He's only making, basically saying those Democrats are bonkers, right? And part of that was because political science was rising at the time, and political scientists said, oh, stop talking about democracy. Everybody believes in democracy. You actually have to just split the nation up by constituencies. And that's how you'll put together enough of a coalition to win. And so people stopped talking about democracy because we all believed in it, right? Mind you, I wasn't alive in 1960, but I think you get the gist. And then in 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States government believed, I think, and the leaders of the government believed that capitalism and democracy went hand in hand. And so long as you promoted capitalism, democracy would follow. And so instead of focusing on the institutions of democracy, they focused simply on money, on capitalism. And what we got very quickly in the former Soviet republics was when the formerly nationalized industries became privatized, they fell into the hands of oligarchs, basically. And by now we have figured out that democracy and capitalism do not go hand in hand. Some of us could have mentioned that before, could have said that beforehand. But what happened was you got extreme amounts of money flowing into political systems in democracies that urged, for example, the cutting of tax rates and the cutting of taxes to concentrate wealth among a very small elite. In part because the oligarchs who were from the former Soviet republics who were putting that money into places like London and into the United States didn't want social welfare programs. They wanted to be able to protect their money. So people stopped protecting democracy. And I think it started to slide away from us because people weren't paying attention. And historians like me have been concerned for a very long time, certainly beginning with Reagan, but under George W. Bush, I vividly remember the first time he used a signing statement, which was it's actually a concept designed by now Justice Alito. At the time, he was in the Department of Justice under Ronald Reagan. And the idea behind signing statements was to claw power away from the Congress and give it to the executive, to strengthen the executive so that the president could do whatever he wanted. And I remember one of those signing statements over torture, in which the Congress had passed a law saying, cut out the torture, guys. and it was sponsored by McCain, and John McCain, who himself had been tortured in Vietnam. And George W. Bush signed it, but said basically, I'm going to do whatever I want. And I remember being horrified by that and recognizing the implications of that and trying to talk to people about it, not like stopping them on the street, but when people asked what I did, mentioning it and then glazing over. Not important to me. I don't get this. Now, of course, people have woken up and they are speaking out for democracy again. And I think that really, really matters. So I think we stopped defending it. And I think we have crossed a river now where people are starting to speak up again and saying, listen, I might not like everything that happens in a democracy. I might not like some of the laws. I might want to change a bunch of the laws. But I know that this is a better system than authoritarianism. Because if I feel like things aren't going very well for people like me under a democracy, I know for sure they're not going to go well in places where I'm not allowed to have a free vote, where somebody can take my property, where they can make me go fight in the front lines the way Putin has done. I'd much rather try my hand at democracy. So the last question I wanted to talk about was, somebody said, how has an administration changed public perception about its accomplishments? And this is key. Because it's funny, I was just reading about this last night. Most Americans, when there was a study done in this book, will say to you that the federal government has never helped them. And yet, when the researchers then give a list of programs, federal programs, something like 96% of people have benefited from one of those federal programs. And it seems there is a huge gap between the reality of what the federal government does and perceptions of it. And one of the things that has been very difficult, I think, for past administrations, Democratic administrations, to do is to advertise what they do, because people weren't paying that much attention. And the Republicans, on the other hand, were trying to cut all that stuff. So they didn't want to talk about what the federal government did. And the thing that has been interesting to watch in the Biden administration is they have not been able to get the word out of what they're doing. Certainly at first, everybody was just constantly, this is going wrong, this is going wrong, this is going wrong. And you can start to see the tide starting to turn, where more people are saying, hey, wait, that bridge in Philadelphia, that was really cool. Oh, wait, I might get broadband so that people can actually probably get this video not on a lag. I don't have broadband here where I live in Maine. They're starting to, I've got health insurance. I've got higher wages. I've got, and somebody wrote very angrily and said, I'm hurting economically. The bottom quarter of the United States has made significantly more money than it did, than it ever has. I mean, it's made up a huge amount of ground, and its wage increases have been significantly higher than inflation. So they're actually doing very well. People are starting to notice that the federal government does a lot of stuff that we actually like. Bridges, look around your house. Bridges are being built. Roads are being built. These are all federal programs. And the way that people's impressions of what the government does change is when people talk about it, when they talk to their neighbors about it, when they say, hey, this is not Tommy Tuberville's money, the way he has implied that is happening in his state. This is federal money. It's federal money that the Democrats put in place to improve the country. And the more people talk about that, the more people will understand that the government is just us. That's all it is. And it's us pooling our resources to do certain things. And that, under this administration, has become a hugely powerful force in our country, again, rivaling the New Deal. And one of the reasons I've been talking about it since the beginning, and by the way, for a long time, everybody kept saying, you are a shill for the Democrats, you're a shill for the Biden administration. And I kept saying, I'm a historian. This is an extremely historic and an exceedingly historic administration. It will be in the history books right up there along with FDR and LBJ and Teddy Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln. And you can't not pay attention to it. You might not like it. That's fine. If you want to say, forget it, we don't need a federal government, certainly your prerogative to do so. But you can't pretend it's not happening. And the degree to which people pretended, especially in the media, kept pretending nothing big was happening has had my hair on fire, not necessarily as a partisan, but as a historian going, how can you not pay attention to what's happening in the Indo-Pacific? How can you not pay attention to the passage of these extraordinary laws, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, the Chips and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, biggest injection of money to address climate change in our history, so much that it pissed off a lot of Europe. You must pay attention to those things in order to understand how this country is growing and changing. So how people's minds change is when they hear what's really happening. And that is, I guess, if we have an assignment going forward, it's to really think about these things and your position on these things, and talking to people about what's happening and saying, hey, yeah, I kind of like this. And maybe I don't like everything that the administration is doing, because you know what? Honestly, if you and I were president, we wouldn't like everything that our administration is doing. But it seems to be moving in a good direction. And that feels to me like it's in the water. And that's, like I say, one of the reasons I'm watching Chris Christie. I think he sees it's in the water. But going forward, protecting democracy means explaining to people that our government is really just us, and we must participate in it to get what we want from it. Not always exactly what we want. We got to compromise with other people. But the way we protect it and make sure people don't swing to autocracy, to a dictator in a democracy, is by making sure they understand that this government belongs to us, and that we should all be treated equally before the law, and we should all have a say in our government. And that's, what I try and do. Anyway, thank you for being here, and I will try and remember when this happens. And I have the brain space and the time now to pick up the history chats again. I got to find my notes, and I will do that, and I will let you know when that's going to be. Thank you for being here.